It's all about the bass. Striped bass are a delicious migratory fish. Every year, they start the commute from in and around the Chesapeake Bay where they spawn and head north as the water warms. Fishermen obsess over the maps, trying to peg the earliest date they might conceivably catch a striper. And not just any striper, a striper big enough to keep. There are limits on fish you're allowed to take, and striped bass have to be at least 28 inches. The fish come to the south side of the Cape first, and we've caught early ones there, but the epic fishing doesn't start until they make their way to the north side and meet up with one of their favorite foods, mackerel. Before I'd ever done it, I thought of fishing as one monolithic activity. You get yourself a pole and a line and some bait, then toss the line out there and see what comes up. Might be a perch, might be a tuna. You hope for the tuna. It doesn't work that way, of course. For starters, you're fishing for something, and you gear up accordingly. If you want trout, you have to fish with something trout find irresistible. In the winter, that's shiners. But irresistibility varies by time of the year, or of the day, or of the tide, by weather conditions or phases of the moon. Sometimes fish feed on the surface, sometimes wild horses couldn't bring them up out of the depths. Sometimes they eat bugs, and sometimes they eat other fish. Sometimes they're on a juice fast. They are diabolical and independent-minded. But in the spring, on the north side of the Cape, the stripers are eating mackerel. So to catch a striper, you first have to catch a mackerel. This is where our friend Bob comes in. Bob grew up around here, fishing. He and his wife Susie spend a lot of time in boats and were two of the first people to help us figure out the lay of the land. We had already had several people not help us figure it out. Cape Codders, particularly those whose families have been here a long time, have a deeply felt sense of history and a commensurate suspicion of newcomers. They call people who come to the Cape from elsewhere wash-ashores, only they pronounce it wash-ashas. If you are a wash-ashore and you encounter people whose families have been here for 400 years, you may not find them eager to divulge local knowledge. I have to say, of all the reasons to turn up your nose at other people, having a family that went absolutely nowhere for 400 years doesn't seem particularly compelling. But when I point this out, it doesn't tend to make them any more forthcoming. Bob, though, doesn't mind a wash ashore, and explained to us how the spring striped bass action works. First, you go out into Cape Cod Bay, where the mackerel hang out. You catch a bunch of them, and then you go into the channel that leads from Barnstable Harbor into the bay. You do this on an outgoing tide because the fish come out with the water. You put one of the mackerel on your line and drift with the tide until you catch a fish. Ha! The first time we tried all this, we were in our boat and Bob was in his with a few of his friends. We went out to the bay for mackerel and did what Bob told us to do, which was to drop a sabiki rig, a string of tiny little hooks that snag on everything and tangle if you look at them funny, but which are very good at catching mackerel. Our boats were maybe 100 yards apart, and we were doing what I thought was the same thing with what I thought was the same equipment, but Bob was catching mackerel and we weren't. "What's Bob doing that we're not doing?" Kevin asked me. I picked up the binoculars, essential fishing equipment for just this purpose. "He's drinking a beer," I reported. Kevin rolled his eyes. "But what else is he doing?" "He's smoking a cigarette." "Great. But how's he jigging?" Bob seemed to be doing exactly what we were doing, letting the jig sink and then pulling it up through the water over and over again. The only difference was that when he pulled it up, there was a fish on it, or several. And this, ladies and gentlemen, is how fishing superstitions are born. As a science journalist, I am well schooled on the difference between correlation and causation. I write about it in my Washington Post column. I rant about it on social media. I am a full-out correlation-causation crank. And I don't even smoke. but I was absolutely ready to light up a cigarette in the interest of catching a mackerel. You would be too, because you're human. And humans, like just about every other animal on the planet, are hardwired for causality. If A happens and then B happens, every fiber of our being will tell us that A caused B. From an evolutionary perspective, it makes perfect sense. If you hear the rustle in the bushes just before the saber-toothed tiger jumps out, you will forever associate the rustle with the tiger and run like hell. Sometimes the rustle will just be a peace-loving antelope, but the downside comes only from not running away from the tiger. If you do run away from the antelope, nothing bad happens. Way back in 1948, behaviorist B.F. Skinner did an experiment in which he put hungry pigeons in cages and sent food pellets down at random intervals. The poor birds ended up believing that whatever they happened to be doing just before the pellet arrived had made it appear, and they kept repeating that behavior. One turned around in the cage, only counterclockwise. One repeatedly stuck its head in the corner. One made pecking motions toward the floor. They'd hop on one leg, bob their heads, or sway back and forth, all because they couldn't believe in randomness.